I suggest that we speed up on the introduction. Is the second day of our Zero Symposium in collaboration with the other universities of Southern Ontario, York University, U of T Mississauga campus, Western University and University of Waterloo with the colleagues there. And I'm very happy to welcome Professor Ajit Mohanty, and I'll go to his introduction directly. We're very privileged to have with us all the way from Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi, India, Professor Ajit Mohanty, to talk about multilingualism and challenges for multilingual education. Dr. Mohanty did his PhD at the University of Alberta, sharing an office with Jim Cummins, whose influence shaped his research interests. However, Dr. Mohanty's real education has been among the tribal communities and children with whom he has worked for over 40 years. In the world of education dominated by the powerful languages, seeking to establish the primacy of tribal mother tongues can be very frustrating. But Dr. Mohanty has helped to develop the state policy for mother tongue-based education in his home state, Odisha, the only state in India to have such a policy, with a program now extended to 21 tribal languages. He has collaborated with Tove Skutnab-Kangas, Robert Phillipson, and Jim Cummins, who are each contributors to his book, The Multilingual Reality, Living with Languages, 2019, Multilingual Matters. Since starting to teach graduate students in 1961, he has lived with passion in this beautiful world of languages and sees this session as a great pleasure and yet another opportunity to learn and grow. Please join me in welcoming heartily Professor Ajit Mohanty. Thank you. And you need to be unmuted and you can share your screen.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I think I'll just take 1 minute break.
Sure.
To go and get my hearing aid. Actually, I forgot my hearing aid. Okay. But I'll do that in a convenient time before I share my slide. Let me tell you that it has been rather a very difficult time for me. After I accepted the invitation to participate in this very interesting symposium, I had a series of mishaps. India is going through a very bad second phase of COVID, and I have had personal tragedies, in my family, and my personal illness, surgery, and quite a few things, and my own son and daughter-in-law, son-in-law suffering from COVID, and a lot of anxiety over their hospitalization and all that.
Oh, God.
And on top of this, last 3 days, I don't know if Bapuji is here, he would know, one of a very close colleague, a friend, died last night, and this morning and day before, 2 of our relatives died, one of COVID and another of cancer. And it has been a really very, very bad time, I must confess.
I'm so sorry. And we even more appreciate that you're here.
In fact, some of you who know, I think if Sally Taylor is here, I think she would know, who knew my conditions probably thought that I would be withdrawing and all that, but I decided to keep, because it's extremely a negative kind of an environment I'm actually going through. But that's why I decided that this is one positive thing. Every day if you keep hearing a news of a death of somebody, a friend, a relative, for last, I would say about 6 weeks or a little more, it has been really a bad time. And therefore, I have been quite a bit disorganized in even preparing my slides the whole day. We had a power failure on top of that, and again, oh yeah, power is back now. So let's hope that I will be able to meet your expectations. I'm trying my best, but let me see. Okay. Okay. I say I should actually thank all of you for this privilege. You know, you are a group of very well-known scholars in the field, students and scholars are interested in the field, and therefore I will try to share with a lot of pleasure and a bit of an anxiety the work that I have been doing over last, I would say, nearly 45 years. I have worked with tribal communities for 40 years now. And so it's
sorry,
kind of,
before you start, I wanted just to make you aware that you're sharing the one with the notes. So it's
I'm sharing with the note. Is that okay with you?
Okay. No, just I wanted to make sure that you are aware of that you're sharing the same that you see on your computer, not the one of the presenter mode. So you're not sharing, we don't see the big screen. We see.
Is the title slide visible to you?
Yeah, 2 slides with your notes. That's what we see. We don't see the big slide.
Okay, how do I
Dr. Mohanty,
if
you just look at your screen, you can see it says use slideshow right there. If you can click that.
Yeah, if you can click there.
Okay, thank you. Now what do I do?
And just share your screen again.
Again, okay. Yeah. Okay.
Yes, perfect.
Okay, that's okay with you now?
Yeah, great. Thank you so much.
And you might have to change the page with your on the screen, not with your controls on the keypad.
It's okay now, it works.
Okay. Can I just take 1 minute break? I just want to go and get my hearing aid. I have a bit of a problem. Is that okay with you? Just 1 minute.
Sure, sure. Yeah. Thank you.
Sorry about that. I'll stop
No
my
problem.
video or whatever. Yeah, stop the video and then come back.
Okay, meanwhile, we can remind you that we have a Padlet that Yesid has just shared with everybody. It has been shared yesterday as well. Is the idea of creating a community with fellow colleagues, and feel free to add your details and research interests so that people remain in contact, or you can see kindred spirits and remain in contact after the conference. And yes, and another thing we wanted to remind you, at the end of the day, there will be okay, you're back. So
no,
great.
You can
Perfect. No. I was just using the time to make some announcements.
Okay.
Perfect.
Okay. See, let me tell you the kind of arguments that I want to enter into. I would first start looking at language and migration issues, trying to argue that surface level diversity over the globe actually does not make the world more multilingual. You know, and the pattern of migration has also a specific relationship with dominant languages, particularly English. And that is what I will show. And then what I will do is I will try to get into the meaning of multilingualism, because when I'm arguing that the societies which are linguistically diverse because of migration, international migration, are not necessarily multilingual. So I'm trying to sort of bring up a distinction between monolingual, dominant monolingual societies and multilingualism or plurilingualism as such. That is one. Then I will try to go into the reasons as to, just a couple of reasons as to why certain societies cannot be really multilingual, despite the fact that large number of languages are present through immigrants. And my argument is the dominant monolingual habitus, the hierarchy, and I will talk about my double divide model, the hierarchy in multilingual societies, which talk about certain languages at the top, few more languages in the bottom, in the middle, and a larger number of indigenous tribal minority and minoritized languages at the bottom. So what I will try to do is go through, I have already that in the book. I will go through the different parts of the world to show you that despite the number of languages, most parts of the world still continue to be dominated by one or few languages, and both in education as well as in the society. And that said, I will come to the Indian context and talk about how the Indian multilingualism has been managed by our policies, and what has actually happened, and what role does dominance of English play. And that would bring me to the question of language of the indigenous tribal minorities, and the question of multilingual education that we are experimenting with among the tribal communities, and then raise some issues. Raise some issues as to why we have not really succeeded in extending the multilingual education to the larger number of minority and indigenous tribal minority groups in India, and what are these implications. And I would at the end say that actually, despite all that is happening, world probably doesn't look, world looks a little more, little more surface level, at the surface level, little more dominant. We have a very bad weather, and you may hear thunders and all that. I hope my power would my trees are weak, but I think we'll try to sort of quickly get into it. So that's, basically I may end up with little note of pessimism about the future of multilingual education. I would say that despite everything that we are talking about, despite all the positive benefits that have been shown for multilingual education, there is probably not much of a future, at least not in India. And therefore, I would like to say that the world has to take note and be cautious as to how we manage multilingualism and multilingual education. I think that's I will now start with my I cannot change my slides. How do I change my slides? Okay, something happened. Okay, I know how to change my slides. Okay, now let's look at the language and international migration pattern. basically, we know that large-scale migration is increasing surface level diversity. That, you look up the migration figures, you know a large number of international migration to certain parts of the world, North American countries, Europe, and some other areas, Middle East, certain parts of Middle East. But actually, if you look at the broader pattern, the higher number of immigrants from linguistically diverse and multilingual countries are going to more linguistically homogeneous countries, or perhaps a little more monolingual kind of societies. So what I'm saying is areas in the world which are really multilingual, large number of people are migrating out of it into areas which are linguistically less diverse, and they have broad diversity in a way. If you look at Europe, if you look at North America, most of the people who constitute or who make up the diversity of the society are immigrants in some form or other. Asia, for example, South Asia, if you look at South Asia, the Indian subcontinent, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Afghanistan, Maldives, and all. There are 660 languages in these countries, in that area. And but there are probably very high number of immigrants from the South Asian countries, 38 million, and more than 38 million, and probably the number has gone up. I'm talking about 2017 figure here. So number may have gone up. And same thing for Africa and other multilingual areas which account for a large proportion of immigrants. Now, generally, the immigrants actually tend to, this is what the relationship with language and migration, is that people try to look for areas which are linguistically proximal to their own language. So linguistic proximity is a factor, definitely. So immigration rates are higher among countries whose languages are similar. But at the same time, let us also not forget that migration to English dominant countries is actually not based on linguistic proximity. In fact, most of the migrants to the English speaking world, UK, USA, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, are from languages which are really linguistically more distant, And also the fact that the average English proficiency of the migrants is higher. There are studies to show that the English proficiency of migrants, even if they, they belong to other language communities, but there is an English language proficiency level which is much higher. And obviously, English dominant countries are sought after destinations for international migration, USA, UK, Australia, and so on. Now, the languages are therefore worldwide languages are getting dispersed. Earlier, they used to remain concentrated in specific locations, specific areas, the indigenous languages in different areas, but they are now spreading out. But that spread does not really affect the multilinguality of the world. That's my contention. And that's partly also because, as this happens, migration into different countries and all that, with the impact of globalization, the dominant languages and all that, the meaning of multilingualism, plurilingualism itself is undergoing a change. I will give you some glimpses of that later. we just had a power failure, so I don't know if I have a weak battery in my computer anyway. The monolingual biases are also very important factor in restricting the impact of the language of the immigrants in the host societies. The dominant orientation that one language, one nation has to have one language, that kind of thing. That the whole idea of linguistic uniformity associated with nation, the political concept of a nation, is somewhat embedded both into popular minds and more so into the minds of our policymakers all over the world. And then there is always a stigmatization of the heritage languages in host societies. Different terms are used in different countries. Canada perhaps uses the term heritage language. There are different terms used for languages of the migrant communities, but there is a stigma associated with that, nevertheless. And the other factor which I think is important is the global presence of English and other dominant languages, the so-called killer languages, as Sputnakangas would tell us, the killer languages which have adversely impacted the diversity in any part of the world in which the language has become dominant. And in fact, English as well as other post-colonial languages. Intergenerational changes in the pattern of language. Again, another factor that's very common, both Europe as well as USA. What has happened is bilingualism in most parts of these, of Europe as well as USA, is actually a point in transition from monolingualism in the native language to monolingualism in the dominant language. So a migrant family, the first generation may be dominantly native speakers in their language, native language. The second generation becomes bilingual. Third generation, generally there are variations. Third generation becomes monolingual in the dominant language. So I would say that bilingualism is a temporary bilingualism when you look within the family. If you look across into the broader society, since new migrants are coming in, the language still continues. But within a particular group of immigrants at a particular point in time, this is what happens. Some people say, Europe, Tabrut Keller and others talk about 3 to 4 generations, but generally 1 to 2, maybe. But in any case, there are intergenerational changes in the pattern of language use. And then societies become multiglossic, not multilingual. This is one thing. You may hear different languages spoken at or used in different contexts, each context. That is what I will show later through our studies on multilingual socialization in India, as well as language socialization and of migrant bilingual children, bilingual and some multilingual children in USA. It's a kind of a isolated use of languages. And then there is an existing dominance and hierarchy across the languages in any society, and I will talk about my double divide model later. That also accounts for the fact that despite dispersion, we are not really, as a world, becoming more multilingual. Now, when you look at societies which are dominantly, monolingual, they remain um, dominantly monolingual in a way, despite global spread of languages, because just the presence of many languages, I would argue, does not make a society multilingual. Um, Societies may have what Gogolin said, the multilingual habitus, the deep-seated habit of assuming monolingualism as the norm. And in dominant monolingual societies, languages are actually used as relatively isolated entities, and that's important. Language, and later on I will show you when I talk about what happens in a multilingual society. You can see the contrast. I am sure you are even aware of it. Um, so languages are actually used as isolated entities with almost impermeable boundaries. You don't transgress across boundaries of languages. So languages are used as in parallel forms, something that Heller actually talked about, parallel monolingualism. So those who can and use multiple languages, use each one of them in specific domains and context. It is a form of, I would think it's a form of multiglossia. Our study of bilingual and multiple language children in USA shows that they use each language in specific contexts, strictly one language at a time. Such rigid and parallel use of language without one language getting into the other, and the boundaries are being kept almost impermeable, doesn't happen in a multilingual society. And I will show you through our work on multilingual socialization. I will show you how and why it happens. So it's not just the presence of many languages, it is how these languages are interrelated socially and cognitively. In multilingual societies, languages extend into each other with flexible and porous boundaries. In any given communication domain, multiple languages complement each other to complete the act of effective communication. So for effective communication in a society like India or any multilingual society, you need to bring in, you may not have proficiency in all the languages, but you need to bring in certain aspect of other languages in order to be able to communicate more effectively. So question therefore is actually, how do the children become or learn to live with multilingual societies? Okay. Now, what I have said is that dominant monolingual societies do not become bilingual despite multilingual, despite dispersion of languages. And there are factors like the dominance and presence of global languages and so on, and also the orientation, one language, one nation kind of orientation and so on. But I think generally to look at the world, I started looking at the multilingual world to begin with, but I think I'm beginning to realize that this is true. What happens is that there is a double divide kind of situation. Languages in any part of the world, particularly when many languages are together, they get arranged in a hierarchy. A hierarchical pattern with some languages, few in fact, one or two, not many, at the top of the hierarchy. And then you have certain major languages of the area or of the region or of the nation, which are in the middle rungs of the hierarchy. And then at the bottom, you have indigenous, tribal, minority, and minoritized languages. And then there is a divide. There is a divide between the languages at the top layer and the middle level languages, and then a further divide between the major national or regional languages and the indigenous tribal minority languages. In India, for example, what happens is English is very dominant, and I will show you. And there are major national languages which are called state level or state level official languages. I will share the pattern with you later, which are more dominant. So English, for example, is sort of gets more power over Hindi, over Odia, which is my home language, my state language, and Telugu, Bengali, Tamil, and all that. So English is more powerful than the other languages, which are more national level languages. And the national level languages try to push the indigenous tribal minority languages in turn. So I call it a situation of double divide. I have written about it and I have to try to show its implications for education and for society and multilingualism as such. Now, let me give you some example. I'm not going into the details of it. I don't have all the figures and of course not my notes now. If you look at the so-called multilingual or multiple language contexts throughout the world, you find the same kind of predominance. You find go to Africa, South Africa, for example, has a very progressive language policy with 11 official languages and all the minority languages recognized and their rights actually asserted in the constitution. Neville Alexander, who was a close associate with Nelson Mandela, actually framed the language policy for South Africa. But despite all that, what you have now is dominance of English. South Asian countries, again, the same kind of a situation, 660 languages, as I told you, and only 50 of them. And that's again the divide that I'm talking about. Not all languages are in education. And only 50 languages in South Asian countries are used as language of instruction. And that too, again, when you look at the pattern of language, and I will show you in India, what happens is school education, primary level school education has more languages. But as you enter the university education, it becomes almost one language, English. Almost, in many countries. So we need to see the declining number, both across the, as you go higher up in education, you have less number of language choices in South Asian countries in particular. Eastern Asian countries, again, the dominance of some languages, not necessarily English, but English and Cantonese, Chinese are dominant languages. Even if languages, a large number of languages are present, I'm mostly putting echelon figures, but there are probably some variations. Central Asia, the same kind of situation. Russian and one of the national languages dominate the countries, and Western Asia again, Arabic, Persian, and other languages dominant. So what I'm trying to argue is that you go to different parts of the world, you find that kind of a hierarchy. Languages are not placed in an egalitarian social order. And that's something that's important to know, or important to think when we are talking about multilingualism across the world. Again, you look at Latin America, Oceania, and Europe, I think the same kind of pattern. If you quickly go through the slide, I will move across because I'm little worried about the weather outside, a lot of thunder and all that. I don't have power already. So I'll try to sort of finish even a little earlier than I anticipated. USA, Canada, obviously, you are much more familiar with the situation than I can give you, but US census figures actually talk about 381 languages. But again, as I already said, transgenerational language shift pressure on migrants and also on the Native Americans, and USA has the highest number of languages in the endangered category in the UNESCO Atlas of World's Languages in Danger. Canada, again, I'm sure you know, I'm citing some figures from Bear Nicholas, Andrea Bear Nicholas and others, which is showing that there is probably a lot of shift of the First Nation languages and so on because of the dominance of one or two or few languages. Now I come to Indian situation. Large number of languages. If you look at census figure, the 2011 census, language declarations were more than 200, sorry, mother tongue declarations were 2,843. It was in fact larger in the earlier census. Every subsequent 10-year census, this is 2011 data. We don't have 2021 data yet. But if you look at successive census in India, both the total number of language declarations as well as the languages to which the census people reduce, all the to major number of major languages, that has been declining. At one point, our census talked about 1,657 languages. The recent census 2011 talks about 121 languages. So there is a politics of languages and how languages are grouped together in societies. And India has broadly linguists agree that it's 300 to 400 languages, although our census locates only 121. A People's Linguistic Survey, which was undertaken, I think, about 3 years back by Ganesh Devi, talks about 780 languages. They used community people in different parts of the country and had them survey the area and come up with detailed data about languages and all that. And Ganesh Devi has identified more than 780 languages. 59 languages are used as by the tribal communities, the indigenous tribal minority communities. Let me give you a little sort of explanation as to why I'm using tribal rather than indigenous, which is more commonly used across the world. In India, tribal is an official term. So we have certain specific criteria to recognize a community as a tribal community. There are certain criteria which Government of India follows, and they notify the tribal communities as tribal as such, because there are many other affirmative action associated with being a tribal. So these are called scheduled tribes because they are listed as tribal communities. So tribal actually is an official term, and that is what I'm using, not in any pejorative sense or whatever. Now, 22 official languages for communication between the states and between the union and the states, 22 official languages. And actually one official language for the Union of India when the Constitution was framed. At that time, soon after independence, everybody thought, okay, English being, since we have got our independence from the British, English should not be part of the constitutional language. But people thought that Hindi was not yet ready to become the national language or the official language. There is no language which is recognized as a national language of India. Very often people think Hindi is the national language of India. That is not true. Constitution does not mention any language in India as a national language. So for the union purposes, for the whole country, English, Hindi was the national language, and they allowed for English to be used along with it for 15 years. 1950, the constitution was framed. So 65, till 65, English was to continue, and thereafter no more. But before 65, a couple of years before, the movement started, a lot of people demanded English and so on. So the constitution was amended to accept a continuation of English as an associate official language for an indefinite period, and English is there to stay now. So we have 22 plus 1, which is English. That is what I'm putting, 23 official languages and large number of languages used in different media. But I would like to draw your attention to the number of languages used as a medium of instruction or language of classroom teaching and learning, and it has been declining. There are other indicators, total number of languages and all that, everything is declining, the number of languages. The diversity, linguistic diversity in education in India is declining over the years, and it is also declining as you go into the higher levels of education from primary to higher level, primary to secondary, post-secondary, technical and university level education. As you go higher up, it becomes almost English as the only language. And that itself has its washback effects, in people demanding English as the language. Anyway, so what I'm saying here, what I'm trying to point out is 1970, 81 languages, that is not even too many for me, 81 languages are used in education, primary education, as language of teaching learning. It came down to 41 by 1998, and 2007 figures, 7 figure, which is now available through our National Council for Educational Research. It says that 31 languages are only used. 31 languages actually mean that 23 are already scheduled languages, which are official languages, and therefore governments are bound to offer education in those languages. So hardly 7 to 8, which are, and that too only 1 or 2, I think, tribal languages, which are part of regular primary education program. So what I have in my writings talked about Indian multilingualism as being multilingualism of the unequals, which is subjected to the linguistic double divide that I just discussed. Now, schooling pattern in India. I think I'm just jumping from one to the other, but I'm trying to show you the dominance of English. Doon schools are a very prestigious group of schools in India, which were there from the British period for the royalty as well as for the aristocratic groups, which are considered still very prestigious kind of schools. And then at the other end of the continuum of schools in India is what I call the doom schools, where children are bound to fail. So I have this categorization of doom schools to doom schools. And I will try to show you what happens, how is English medium schooling in India is directly linked to social stratification. You can see the 5 types of school that I am talking about: exclusive, elitist English medium residential schools, for example, Doon schools. Then you have high-cost English medium schools for the privileged class. You have low-cost English medium school for the less privileged class. There are a large number of schools coming up in slum areas, rural areas, where parents don't mind spending 10% of their income in getting their children educated, because they think that English will actually change the future of their children and so on. And then you have the government schools, which are for the regional majority language children who cannot afford any of the other types of schools. And then you have the indigenous tribal minority group of children who are put into submersion education in the dominant language of the region. not in their own language. So these are the 5 types of schooling, and I have sort of given you the hierarchy and the relationship between the school divide and the social divide. The same kind of thing that I discussed about earlier. Now the question is, okay, English medium schools are here to stay, but who do they teach? And I say, who do they cheat? Because what happens is obviously those parents who can pay, who have a support, the early language socialization is for English in many of the upper class families, and that is what I have shown through some of our language socialization studies. So English already has a head start from the families of the upper class parents, because they can speak English. That is not the same thing for parents from the lower economic strata. So what happens is that you can see that the children from the so-called English medium schools who belong to the lower strata of the society, because their parents don't know English. Therefore, and we have some other studies which I am not discussing here, which show that in these kind of schools, which are low cost, poor quality English medium schools, English is actually taught in Hindi or in the regional language, because children do not understand, parents do not support English learning, and therefore what teacher does, they read a text in English and immediately translate into the local language in order for the children to understand, and then some of the question answers are loudly repeated in the class so that children can remember and all that kind of thing. Anyway, I'm not going into that. So as I said, 5 to 10% of income parents spend, and that is quite a lot of money for the very poor rural family or the tribal family to send their children to English medium schools. But they do not learn, because English medium schools have teachers who themselves are not at all proficient in English. They cannot even write a few words in English on the blackboard. And but just in the name of English medium school, the children are put together, given very poor quality education. And since it is in a language which they do not understand, they probably don't learn much. That is why I call them doom schools, because they don't learn. And what I am saying, therefore, the children from the English medium schools, which are poor quality and parents are paying a lot, they actually get cheated. So English medium schools definitely teach the upper class children, and the lower class whose parents cannot afford good quality schools, they get cheated. That English medium schools are superior to regional language medium schools or the mother tongue medium schools is a myth which is systematically propagated in India, and I think in most parts of the multilingual world, Africa and other countries. Because if you really carefully control for socioeconomic status differences and quality of schooling, and then compare children in English medium and regional language or mother tongue medium schools, we have done some research which actually shows, and there are some of our students also all over the country, Nagaland, Uttar Pradesh, and various parts of the country, where we clearly show that when you control for that, English medium schools are not really better. Mother tongue medium, Assam, for example, for the Bodo medium schools and English medium school comparison, we clearly showed in the same school they had Bodo sections and English sections. We found that Bodo section children doing much better because their understanding of mathematics, understanding of science, conceptual understanding was much better, and I think this is also the kind of pattern that is observed all over the world, that it's a myth to that English medium schools are necessarily superior. So the question is that whose development? English is always projected as a language of development. Whose development does English support? The Matthew effect studies show that English uh, gives more to the privileged and less to the less privileged. The typical Matthew effect give more onto them who have more, that kind of. Our studies also show the same kind of phenomenon. So whose development actually English support? It only, it supports development of those who are already in a way on their way to development. Their parental support is there, family is in the higher economic bracket and so on. Say soon after independence sighting in the late 50s, our Prime Minister Nehru said that English medium or English schooling is creating a caste system in India, which is English knowing caste and the caste which is not knowing English. And he thought that as kind of situation has to go. But my analysis of what is happening now is that we have created another subcaste. It's not just English knowing or not knowing, but the quality of English that you know. If you are educated in good quality English medium schools, you you have all kinds of support. And then if you belong to the low quality English medium schools, you do not know. So it's not just whether you know or not know English, but what kind of English do you know and so on. So what is happening is when you put children in our educational system to that kind of a schooling which really discriminates, schools as instruments of social justice do become instruments of discrimination in the society when certain languages are neglected. So in India, and I think it's all over the world, the indigenous tribal minority languages usually get neglected in education. So they suffer from social educational neglect, which weakens a language. As we all know, if education is language is not being used in education, it becomes weaker. And then that weakness of language is something that our policymakers use to justify why a language cannot be used in education. So it's a kind of a vicious cycle of discrimination. In India, I have heard so many bureaucrats and political leaders say that, okay, how can a tribal language be used as a language of science, language of mathematics, language of higher level thinking and all that, because they are not even written, that they don't have a writing system. I said, do you know that English doesn't have its own indigenous writing system? It's a borrowed system. So why can't a tribal language be written in another script system and be used in education? So it's a kind of a vicious cycle of language disadvantage that is happening, and we know that neglect of language has a lot of consequences for a child, and we have a lot of data from India to support this, and I think in different parts of the world similar data is available. So what happens to a tribal child, particularly, in the dominant language classroom? Because this is one thing that happens. Most of our tribal children, 99% of tribal children are in classrooms where the language is not their own. Because when India developed its policy for the school language or language in education policy, they said regional language or mother tongue would be used as the language of teaching in the early grades. So what happened when it came to the states, provinces or the states, they found it convenient to impose the regional language on all children. Odisha, for example, 1/5, almost nearly 1/5, more than 23% of our population is tribal. Odisha is one of the states in India, and I belong to that state. So Odisha has 23 to 20, nearly 1/5, more than 1/5 of our children who belong to tribal communities. And then what happens is if you impose Odia on them, Odia is the dominant regional language, they are all subjected to Summerson education. So these are some of the things. I will show you some photos because it's becoming little boring. Let me show you some pictures as to what happens when a child is put in a Summerson program.
Dr. Mohanty, we have we have a few minutes. How long do you need? How much time do you need?
I thought I had 50 minutes. How much time have I?
Yeah, well, I could say 10, if we have 10 minutes to finish at 10:30, would that be okay?
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you.
Let me try that. Yeah. Okay, so just quickly see what happens to them. I'm not going to spend a lot of time elaborating on that. Now we have so what is happening because of that kind of a situation, we tried to bring in multilingual education. I personally made a lot of effort, and there are other people who have. And this is broadly the pattern of multilingual education in the country is putting every child into 6 to 8 years. It has over the years actually become 5 years now. And mother tongue plus L2, second language, which is the dominant language, and then L3, which is usually English, that is brought in, and so that is what is supposed to happen. Now, there are typical aspects of growing up in a multilingual society. Let me sort of quickly have you go through the slide. So what I'm saying is that languages in Indian situation, when we talk of multilingual society, languages are porous, they get into each other, and children operate with a linguistic repertoire, set of languages used as tools for convenient, for effective communication. Languages have their distinct identity. I'm not saying that languages do not exist and they are imagined concepts. No, languages are very real for the language users. They know what are the languages they are used. They know what is their own language and so on. But languages are more in a composite kind of representation in the mind, and many of our children actually grow up with multilingualism as a first language, number of languages and so on. And what I have described in my studies is how do they get into, gradually increasing layers of languages are added on. So child begins from the immediate family neighborhood, and then as the child becomes more mobile, goes into wider areas of communication, you have an increasing layer of multilingualism with which children grow up. And then there are processes of multilingual socialization, about which I have written quite a bit. There will be a forthcoming publication, myself and Sputnam Kangas, which will also describe in detail how children are socialized in multilingual societies. The main argument that we are making, both Tove and myself, is that children grow up as multilingual, naturally multilingual, but unfortunately schools ignore all of their language resources and imposes a dominant language on them. So we argue that the education actually does not support multilinguality of children. Children do develop, and this is where I want to bring in a kind of a different orientation to multilingual education, because so far multilingual education has been more or less blindly borrowing the bilingual education model. I'm saying that there are features in multilingual society which call for slight rethinking. One of the features that I will point out, and that I will not discuss the others, particularly is the cognitive academic language proficiency seems to develop much earlier in case of children from India, because they grow up in a multilingual, much more complex, challenging linguistic environment, and therefore they develop insights into how languages are compared, what are the similarities and contrasts across languages. Therefore, thinking, metacognitive, metalinguistic thinking and cognitive academic language proficiency probably grows before formal schooling. That is one thing that I would like to underscore, and that is something that probably calls for a slightly reoriented model of bilingual education in our kind of society. Again, the pigs and calf distinction. Usually, if you look at the typical bilingual education model, the basic interpersonal communication skills are conceptualized in a language-specific manner. That child has a proficient ability to socially communicate in her own mother tongue. Now, that's probably not just the case in India. Children grow up with multiple languages through language socialization. They can use multiple languages and so on. Okay, I think I will quickly. These are some of the multilingual education programs that we tried out in India. Since we are talking about the future of multilingual education, let me tell you that Andhra Pradesh was the first state in India to start a program of multilingual education in 8 tribal languages, and it got extended to 2,133 schools. But after 15 years, the program was just unceremoniously closed without even a declaration, and all the mother tongue medium schools, which are government schools, government primary schools in tribal languages, they were converted to English medium schools of the government. So that's the kind of thing that I'm trying to draw your attention. So Odisha, we had some program. There is a policy which developed in the second phase of the Odisha program 2005, and we had our own experiments called Multilingual Plus program, which is a special intervention that we had. Again, I will not. This was the state of Odisha, and the 2 projects areas shown there as MLE Plus were the projects that we experimented with or intervened with in 2 languages, 2 of the tribal languages in Odisha, and that I think is, let me show you, but I think we have a slide. I have a video which you can download. I give you the link to that. I think it's given there in the earlier slide. Yeah, the link is there, the YouTube link, where you can see what we actually did in the multilingual education program. So what I'm saying is basically, again, if you look at this model, I'm talking about peaks developing more composite manner in L1, L2, and LX, and so on. And the TALP also developing little earlier than schooling. And therefore, we need to sort of rethink about that kind of a situation. We had some classroom observation classroom application of the new thinking about multilingual education in our society, now in India, to show that even in multiple language classrooms where children have many mother tongues, it's possible to use a model of multilingual education where each child's mother tongue is fostered along with awareness of languages. So going back to the kind of questions that we had, does multilingual education have a future? Again, coming from India, and I'm directly associated with the Indian multilingual education programs, I developed a policy for my state, which declared officially that all tribal children must be educated in the mother tongue medium, mother tongue based multilingual education program. But right after that, 2014, the policy was declared. After that, the government says that any talented tribal child will be sponsored by the government to go to English medium schools, private English medium schools. Government will be supposed to supporting them. So there are a lot of other things that they are doing, which is exactly opposed to the policy they themselves have declared. Therefore, I would like to end this with an optimistic note, but unfortunately, my own experiences with multilingual education in this country doesn't allow me to say that yes, this will continue, because it may, but right now I think things are looking very bad for I think all over the world. You know, I have worked with the Nepal program. Yes, Nepal program is, they have a policy, but there are also problems with that. I think I will end here. I'm sorry I took a little longer than projected, but I think I have been a little worried about all kinds of things. You know, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ajit, Dr. Mohanty, for this wonderful and informative conference and lecture.